Hello, my name is Brendan Forrest, and this channel will follow the American Civil War as it happens from its beginning 160 years ago in April 1861 until its conclusion in 1865. Through the weeks, I will highlight the events, the people, the politics, and the tragedy that was America's great struggle. This is Civil War. "4:30 in the morning, April 12, 1861. South Carolina forces, under the command of Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard, opened fire on the Union-held Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, officially starting the American Civil War. The fort itself was not fully constructed, nor was it occupied prior to South Carolina's secession. To gain a more defensible position, the Union-loyal fort commander, Major Robert Anderson, transferred his troops and supplies secretly to the fort only days after the state's withdrawal from the Union. The battle was a result of President Abraham Lincoln's refusal to abandon key government property in the South. He refused to recognize Southern secession from the Union. The American flag flew atop the fort for months, insulting the newly created Confederate States of America. On multiple occasions, Confederate emissaries were sent requesting and then demanding the surrender of the fortress island. To each request, Major Anderson refused. The rebels reacted to this refusal by laying siege to the island. Fort Sumter was only one of more than 5 fortified positions meant to protect the port city of Charleston. From these positions, the Confederates determined to wait out the defenders and, once out of supplies, obtain the fort without incident. Command of the fort fell to Kentucky-born Robert Anderson. On an ironic note, Major Anderson was Beauregard's artillery instructor at West Point. Beauregard now had the opportunity to show his old instructor what he had learned. The Confederates had deployed 47 heavy-caliber guns and mortars for use in the bombardment of Fort Sumter. The Union, while possessing 60 guns, was disadvantaged by limited range and ammunition, of which they had only about 700 rounds. Although the South planned on the fort's surrender being obtained upon the exhaustion of their supplies, Abraham Lincoln dispatched a resupply fleet to Sumter. This fleet had arrived and was waiting just offshore for daylight in order to enter the harbor. This arrival forced the hand of Beauregard to dispatch one final ultimatum to the fort at 3:20 a.m. Major Anderson, not knowing of the relief vessels waiting offshore, claimed he would be forced to surrender due to lack of supplies by noon of the 15th instant, unless he received controlling instructions from my government or additional supplies. Knowing the fleet filled with additional supplies was outside the harbor, the Confederate emissaries knew this was impossible. They presented the demand for surrender, giving Anderson 1 hour to capitulate or else be fired upon. To this, Anderson replied, "General, I have the honor to acknowledge the receipt of your communication demanding the evacuation of this fort, and to say in reply thereto that it is a demand with which I regret my sense of honor and of my obligations to my government prevent my compliance. Thanking you for the fair, manly, and courteous terms proposed, and for the high compliment paid me, I am, General, very respectfully, your obedient servant, Robert Anderson, Major, 1st Artillery, commanding." The guns opened fire at 4:30. It has long been believed the fire-eater secessionist Edmund Ruffin fired the first shot at Fort Sumter, but history has proven this to be inaccurate. In fact, one Lieutenant Henry S. Farley, in command of 2 10-inch siege mortars on James Island, has received credit for firing the first shot in this engagement. The fire at the fort was incredibly hot, coming from multiple directions. Captain J.G. Foster of the Corps of Engineers noted the accuracy and intensity of the Confederate bombardment, saying, "The direction of the enemy's shells being from the northeast, north, southwest, and southeast, sought every part of the work, and the fuses being well graduated, exploded in most instances just within line of parapet." Major Anderson withheld opening fire until 7 o'clock, aware of his lack of shells. Once firing commenced in the fort, Captain Abner Doubleday, the future general who commanded at the Battle of Gettysburg, but at this point the fort's second in command, fired the first shell in response to the Southern bombardment. The fort, built for harbor defense, was inadequate to the task of defending from a landward bombardment. Fire was so intense, the guns on the top level were unable to be manned due to the lack of protection. The bottom level guns had insufficient elevation to fire over the walls of the Southern positions. Soon the defenders had only 6 cannon to respond, albeit intermittently, as if to accomplish nothing more than informing the Confederates they were still there. Confederate fire was steady and intense throughout the day. 2,490 projectiles were fired from Fort Moultrie alone, with over 4,000 total rounds being expended. 3 times the barracks at Fort Sumter caught fire and was successfully extinguished. At one point during the battle, the American flag was shot off its pole, and Lieutenant Norman J. Hall climbed the flagstaff and nailed the flag back into place. Such was a defiance towards this first act of rebellion. On the morning of April 13th, the final rice rations were distributed. Hot shot from the Confederate guns started a fire around the ammunition magazine, and only 50 barrels of powder could be saved before they were forced to bury the magazine to prevent the deadly explosion. The fort was now desperate for supplies. By 2 p.m., deeming the conditions of honor satisfied, the defenders had enough. They surrendered according to the terms which had been offered 3 days ago on April 11th. The battle, starting a war costing more American lives than any other in American history, ended without death on either side. A total of 34 hours of bombardment with thousands of pounds of ordnance shot resulted in the death of a single Confederate horse. Just prior to the Union evacuation of the fort, which had been their home for close to 4 months, Beauregard allowed Major Anderson the honor of firing a 100-gun salute to their valiant defense of the fort. This salute was cut short, and the first death of the war occurred when an ember landed in powder, causing a violent explosion, killing 1 and injuring 5 other Federal soldiers. That first death of the Civil War was one Private Daniel Howe. Hundreds of thousands would follow. Major Anderson folded up the American flag that so defiantly flew and brought it home with him aboard the relief ship, which had been dispatched to relieve the fort, but was now taking them home to New York. He claimed the flag would be used as a burial shroud upon his death, but that would not be. That flag will once again fly over Fort Sumter 4 deadly, desperate, and tragic years from now. On April 13th, Minnesota's Governor Alexander Ramsey, in Washington at the time, traveled to the White House upon learning of the bombardment of Fort Sumter. He promised Lincoln 1,000 volunteers to fight for the Union. These men were the first of any state in the Union to answer the call. They would become the first Minnesota Volunteer Regiment and would fight in virtually all of the battles in the East. On the 15th, as a result of the bombardment of Fort Sumter, Lincoln called for 75,000 men to serve for 90 days. These men would be known as the 90-Day Wonders. Many slave states will receive this call for troops poorly. Tennessee's Governor Isham Harris declared, "Tennessee will furnish not a single man for the purpose of coercion, but 50,000 if necessary for the defense of our rights and those of our Southern brothers." On the 17th, in response to Lincoln's calls for troops, Virginia, in a secret meeting, voted to secede from the Union after previously voting against secession on April 4th. Also on this day, Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, issued a proclamation inviting all interested ship captains to apply for letters of marque and reprisal in order to become privateers. On the 18th, Francis P. Blair Sr., on behalf of President Lincoln, offered Colonel Robert E. Lee command of all Union forces being raised to fight the Confederacy. Lee declined, stating, "Though opposed to secession and appreciating war, I could take no part in an invasion of the Southern states." On April 19th, riots caused by Southern Loyalists began in Baltimore as the 6th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Regiment passed through en route to Washington. Assailed by rocks, bricks, and gunshots, the New Englanders returned fire at a cost of 12 killed and another 17 wounded. The Anaconda Plan began this day when Lincoln announced the blockade of all Southern states from South Carolina through Texas, adding Virginia and North Carolina to the list upon their secession. On the 20th, Lee resigned from the United States military after 32 years of service. The Naval Yard in Norfolk, Virginia, was abandoned with many ships being burned, one of which being the USS Merrimack. The hull of the Merrimack would be refloated and converted into the ironclad CSS Virginia. On April 23rd, Robert E. Lee is made a major general in the Virginia forces and assumed command of all land and naval forces in Virginia. Albert Sidney Johnston left his post in California on the 25th and began the long ride east, ending a year from now at Shiloh. On the 26th, Joseph E. Johnston was made commander of all Virginia state forces in and around Richmond. Johnston and Lee were classmates at West Point together. Both were engineers. Johnston graduated 13th out of 46. Lee, however, graduated 2nd. On the 27th, Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus, and Thomas Jackson was placed in command of the lower Shenandoah Valley and the city of Harper's Ferry. This ends the first 2 weeks. It was a very confusing and conflicting time, with citizens having to decide where their allegiance lay. Was it with their country or their state? Of the 1,080 officers in the military prior to secession, 313 resigned their commissions or were dismissed. 286 of them entered service with the Confederacy. There were 824 active West Point graduates. 184 went south. In civilian life, there were 900 graduates. 114 would return to the Union, and 99 would seek Southern commissions. In the end, the war that would cost hundreds of thousands started with Fort Sumter and Lincoln's call for a volunteer force to quell the rebellion and recapture the fort. They will indeed take Fort Sumter back again, but that won't be for another 4 years of bloody conflict. Civil war has begun.